Connor used to reside in a small town near a lake. Each year on the night before Halloween, Connor and his friends, Corey and Ryan, would each place a pumpkin in the lake. On Halloween, they would travel to the other side of the lake to see if their pumpkins had arrived. On a cold October night, Connor had gathered his friends at the lake. They each carefully set their pumpkins in the dark water. The boys knew that they should head home. There had recently been a kidnapping after all. Connor and Ryan started to walk back, but something had caught Corey's eye. He informed the others that he thought he saw something behind a tree that was only a handful of yards away. The tree lay in front of a thick forest, letting anything that used to lurk behind it hastily escape view. Early in the afternoon, Connor and his friends were at the lake, eager to start the long trek to the other side. There had been a brief downpour the previous night, hence the ordinary bare dirt path had shifted into a damp mud. As the boys were walking, Ryan pointed out what looked to be light footprints traveling down the trail. However, Connor and Corey didn't think much of it. As they continued down the path, they spotted the lake. The boys ran towards it, eager with anticipation. When they stepped foot on the small patch of grass that bordered the lake, Connor noticed something. His pumpkin, an average-sized pumpkin with a stem that curled and ended in a point, rested on the grass. Ryan's pumpkin was on the shore, about a yard away. Corey's pumpkin, however, was nowhere to be found. When Connor was at his house, he started to carve the pumpkin. However, something was wrong. The pumpkin had a small slit near the top. When Corey finished carving the top of the pumpkin, he noticed a small bag inside. The bag contained a note that read, "Have a jolly Halloween." Connor was visibly perplexed by the note. "Why did someone put this in my pumpkin?" Connor thought aloud. Connor decided aloud that it might have been in there before he even bought the pumpkin. The slit was hardly visible, so he could have overlooked it. That night, Connor and his friends were ecstatic to go trick-or-treating. They walked around the neighborhood for about an hour before coming to halt at a certain house. Corey stopped the others and pointed out what he thought was the pumpkin that he had released into the water on the previous night. Connor and Ryan both informed him that the pumpkin just looked similar and was not in fact his. 1 hour later, Connor and his friends were at the house comparing how much candy they had each received. Connor was going through his candy when he felt a small piece of paper. The paper read, "I hope you had a jolly Halloween." Connor gasped in shock. He quickly informed his friends about the note he had found earlier in the day and asked them if they had found similar notes among their candy. Ryan and Corey carefully searched through their candy to no avail. Now Connor was scared. He started to question everything in the past couple of days. Ryan informed him that it must be a coincidence, and maybe they were all just overthinking it. Connor liked that idea. He put his candy away and said goodbye to his friends. The next day, Connor had no school, but his parents had to work, so he was alone. After a while, he got hungry, so he reached into the jar that housed his candy. He felt a strange object, so he pulled it out. In his hand was a square piece of candy with a red wrapper sealing it shut. One side of the wrapper was slightly transparent. Connor unwrapped the candy, only to find a box. The box had a small camera lens on the side, and the top read, "Soon you won't be so jolly." Connor stumbled backward and ran outside in a panic. Connor's backyard was right next to a dense forest, so he tried to flee. But I rushed to him and grasped him. The boys' struggling stopped after some time, and I was easily able to drag him into the forest. Needless to say, he won't be jolly for a long time. As a child, my favorite part of Halloween was the pumpkin carving. At first, my brother and I would just watch our dad do it, since we were too young to play with knives, but as we got older, we were allowed to make our own. I was much better at it than my brother, but he didn't seem to mind. He wasn't into the artistry of it as much as I was. I loved it so much that our dad would take me back to the pumpkin fields every few days so I could continue creating my masterpieces. Everyone loved my pumpkins. The neighbors would always say how talented I was to craft such expressive faces. My dad started calling me his little Carver. I even started carving pumpkins for people in the neighborhood. Pretty soon, everyone had my famous pumpkins on their front stoop. I remember my dad bragging to one of the neighbors that I could probably carve a pumpkin in my sleep. The Halloween after I turned 12, I got the most candy of any previous year. People gave me extra as a way of saying thank you for the pumpkins. There was so much that I gave some to my brother, which I normally wouldn't do. He gave me a big hug and said he loved me, so I smacked him and called him an idiot. We ate so much candy that we went to bed with stomach aches. That night, I had a dream that I went to the pumpkin fields alone. It was dark, and all I could see in every direction were pumpkins of all shapes and sizes. I strolled the rows, searching for the perfect one. A voice from behind me said, "Pick me." So I turned around to see a huge, magnificent pumpkin. It was almost as big as I was and looked ripe for the carving. A knife appeared in my hand, and I went to work, stabbing and slicing as inspiration took over. When I was finished, it was the greatest creation of my young life. Brimming with pride, I took a step back and admired my achievement with a satisfied smile. The next morning, they rushed my brother to the hospital, but it was too late. Halloween used to be my favorite holiday. It was the one time of year you could be anything you wanted to be. You could draw out your darkest desires and display them for the world to see. No one would think you were odd for being the person you always wanted to be. There was no judgment for your choice of attire, and oftentimes you were commended for that choice. Then at the end of the night, you received a reward for your efforts in the form of a bag full of candy. I'm far too old to go door to door begging for treats, but I enjoy watching my children do the same. Weeks in advance, we let them pick their costumes. They are far too young to delve into the ghastly, and usually end up picking a character of a popular movie or TV show. I simply take my pictures and urge them on to each doorway. I always remind them to say, "Trick or treat," before the door opens. It has been this way for a few years now, but I am starting to question the tradition, especially after visiting 113 Forest Road. The past year, we made the rounds to our local neighborhood. We made sure to only approach homes that had their porch light on, which was the unspoken rule. Our night had almost come to an end when we reached a home that had been vacant for the last 2 seasons. It was the largest within our neighborhood, towering at 2 stories when all others only had 1 level. It was a large brick Victorian monstrosity that may have once been beautiful, but the landscape had long needed work. It was the house most kids made stories about, and when we saw the dim glow of that yellow bulb, I was unsure of letting my children approach. My oldest begged to ring the doorbell, and my youngest simply wanted more candy. I was outnumbered and relented at their pleas. My wife sat within the idling vehicle, while I followed close behind. The two made their way up the steps, and I waited at the bottom. Like always, I reminded them of what to say. My oldest son held his brother's hand and pressed the lighted button. Ringing, much like church bells, echoed from within the house for a moment before returning to silence. After a few seconds, they turned to me with questioning looks. I had noticed a moving truck parked outside the home earlier in the month and knew someone must live there, but I had not seen them. There was no car in the driveway, and I did not see any lights on inside. I started to think they were simply gone and left the light on in case it was dark by the time they returned. I waved my children to come back to the car and told them we would just head home. The look of disappointment on their faces told me they were not ready to end the night just yet. Their faces lit up as the door creaked to life and a voice beckoned them to wait. "Trick or treat!" they screamed with excitement. A feeling rolled in me like thunder, and a signal of danger rang in my head. Something was not right. If they were home all this time, where was the car I had seen sitting in the driveway the last few weeks? I instinctively advanced on my two children, taking the steps in leaps. A feeling inside me told me they should not go toward that voice, and I called them to stop as they turned to the door.
"I chose both."
The voice seemed strained, like that of a lifetime smoker. Two ragged hands shot from the parted pathway and drew both of my little boys inside. Their screams echoed in my head. My adrenaline shot me forward, but my body slammed against a closing door. I pounded repeatedly, screaming obscenities of every nature. My body shook violently as my world became a spiral of despair. The whole scene drew the attention of my wife, and soon she was right beside me. In an effort to find the entry, I took a step back, lifted my right foot, and dropped it full force into the hardwood. The door frame shattered, allowing the barrier to fly freely into the darkness. I cried out in terror for my little boys as I rushed through each room. My entire reason for living had been snatched up in an instant, and I had been too late to stop it. When the house had been searched completely with no results, my wife phoned the authorities through wails of agony. We both held each other until sirens lit up our tiny neighborhood. It has been a year now, and we still have no answer as to what happened to our children. My wife distanced herself from me, and I'm sure she blames me for what happened. I don't fault her for that. I blame myself as well. If I had not let them go to that door or listened to my feelings sooner, they would both still be here. Halloween is no longer a time of fun for us, but a reminder of our mistakes. I don't even leave my house on that night, and even the sight of a pumpkin makes tears stream down my face. The drive home from work is especially hard, witnessing the houses that decorate for the occasion. I'm almost in a panic before I close myself within the safety of my home. Please, if you read this, don't let your kids visit 113 Forest Road on Halloween. Trick or Treat Stalker by XXT213. I live in a substantially normal neighborhood. I can't really say that the people here are shady. Most of them are just old. To give a little background on my town, most of the streets are parallel to each other, especially the section I live in. There's a lot of young people moving in because many of the old people in the town are moving into nursing homes, or, unfortunately, passing on. I think it would be safe to say I know most of the people who live in the area. Not personally, but I can recognize faces. Last year, my friends and I decided to go out trick-or-treating one final time. We were acting like angsty teenagers who thought it wasn't cool anymore, but we had already gotten costumes and wanted some candy. However, we thought it wasn't cool anymore. But looking back, I don't think trick-or-treating is safe anymore. Truly. Anyway, I had to play a field hockey game after school, so I was itching to hang out with my friends. I finally headed home and got my costume on. At this point, it was getting dark, so my mom demanded I bring a flashlight. She's very protective and kind of strict. My dad, on the other hand, is the opposite. He's more willing to let me go places on my own, and convinced my mom it would be okay if I went out trick-or-treating with a group of friends. Mom didn't like there not being a parent around, but she knew we would stay within a couple of streets. Eventually, she let up and allowed me to go. My friends began to show up at my house, but by the time we left, it was pitch black. Once again, my mother warned about strangers. I scoffed at her, trying to shake off the embarrassment of being lectured by my mom in front of my friends. I knew she was right, though. Maybe a group of high school girls could take down a predator, but I knew I couldn't by myself. I stayed as close as I could with my friends for most of the night, keeping an eye out for any weird figures or killer clowns, since there were rumors of some terrorizing an elementary school a few towns over. Everything seemed to be going well, and we were all having a good time. Apart from trying to avoid our classmates out of sheer humility for trick-or-treating, all of my friends and I made some really good memories. Then it happened. It was around 8:45, and some of my friends were tired and wanted to be picked up. We gradually made it to my house, where they phoned their parents and left. I was a little upset. It might have been my inner child in me, but I wanted more candy. I knew this was quite possibly my last year trick-or-treating ever. I really wasn't ready to give up yet. My one friend, we'll call her Nancy, did not want to stop yet either. After all my other friends had left, we asked my parents if we could go out for another 30 minutes or so. My mom was reluctant. However, my dad told her I was old enough, and most people wouldn't answer doors this late anyway, so we would be back pretty soon. It was about 10 after 9 this point. Nancy and I went to the next street over in the opposite direction we had gone with our group previously. I remember feeling uncomfortable for some reason, but brushing it off as I turned on my flashlight. It was pitch black, and the sidewalks were bumpy and cracked because the one town was too lazy to fix them. I had a pretty bright flashlight that could shine 20 feet ahead of me or so. We made it to the next street and looked down. There were barely any porch lights on. I guess people figured the little kids were done and decided it was the end of the night. However, Nancy and I were not willing to give up that easily and started at the first house on the left. No answer. Okay. We went across the street that had a porch light on, but no one answered from that house either. I still wasn't willing to stop though. We tried a few more houses and got no answers. Nancy suggested we try 3 houses, and if no one answered, then we would go back to my place. I agreed, sadly knowing that no one would give us more candy this late into the night, and that this was truly the end. That's when I saw him out of the corner of my eye. It was a black figure walking down the road. It walked toward the house me and Nancy were standing at. He was wearing all black with his face down and a hood over his head. Something about him made my stomach lurch. I discreetly pointed him out to Nancy. She said she saw him a few houses before, just turning onto the street. This made me feel even more uneasy. Quickly, he began to approach us with his head down and his hands in his sweatshirt pockets. Looking back, who knows what he could have been hiding in there. The street was dead quiet now, except for me and Nancy, so he must have heard us. I instructed for us to go to the house across the street to make it seem like we were trick-or-treating and never noticed the man. We went to the house and knocked on the door. I was secretly praying someone would answer so the man could not get near, but no one did. I was really freaking out now. I turned around and he was walking on the street in front of the house, right next to us. Then I realized he had crossed the street too. A wave of panic overtook me. I grabbed Nancy's arm and sprinted to the house he had just passed. Then he circled around and began following us in the same direction. I knew I had to do something. He began walking faster and faster towards us. Nancy and I sprinted for it. There was a good amount of space in between the street and mine, but I was on track and was willing to do anything to get away from this psychopath. He didn't run, but when I finally looked back, I saw him quickly walking the same way, still with his head down. From what I could tell, he seemed fairly young, maybe in his 30s. I didn't recognize anyone from this area. Nancy and I were still running though. Finally, we made it to my street, and we hid near some bushes at the end. Then I realized we still had our flashlights on, and that's how he was so easily able to locate us. Hurriedly, we shut them off, crouching near the bushes and waited. I knew that if we tried to run to my house, he would see us. There wasn't enough time to make it there without him getting to the end of the street and seeing us. I was also terrified that he would find out where I lived. Never bring someone who's following you back to your house. Nancy and I finally saw him. He stood in the middle of the street and just peered down it. I could see his eyes. That's how close we were. They looked so blank and so menacing. He knew we were somewhere, just not in the bushes, only 10 feet away. After a few minutes, he carried on walking. Nancy and I waited until he was at the next street. We could see him walking down the sidewalk, and then we booked it to my house. I told my parents, but my father only laughed at me, and my mother looked too tired to care. My brother sat there and made fun of me for being paranoid. I am never going trick-or-treating again. Who knows what could have happened to me that night, or what that man was capable of. Later, there was a news story about children who had been abducted a few towns over. It could have easily been Nancy and me. So, creepy Halloween stalker, let's not meet.